We left off at verse 9. We finished up verse 9, and we start in verse 10. And in Esther 2, 10 and 11, it says, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Now, there wasn't a lot of anybody doing any kind of deep theological writings on this section, and it doesn't have, I don't believe it has direct implications to what us as Christians believe today, but it does have a little bit of an implication about hiding one's identity. And we don't want to make the correlation between Christians and Jews, okay? Because that's not what this passage is referring to. So let's talk a little bit about who was Esther and why was she hiding it. First of all, Esther, we don't get any sense from the scripture that Esther tried to hide her identity, except that Mordecai said you need to do it. Don't tell anybody you're Jewish. So, what was the problem? So the problem back then was that these people were all the ones that were taken captive earlier, much earlier, and these were the descendants of those people that were taken captive. There didn't seem to be, from what I can gather, a whole lot of hostility toward the remnants of the captives that were there. They were allowed to stay, or they were allowed to go. So because they could do whatever they wanted to do, in my opinion of what I read here is that it wasn't like something real serious that you needed to hide. Now, let's take a look at from Mordecai's position. Mordecai is looking, and remember, I don't want to say this in a way that makes you think that God had nothing to do with this, because he had everything to do with it. But leave God out of the picture from their perspective, okay? I don't believe that they were Jewish law-abiding Jews, because there's no reference to any of them being law-abiding Jews. They were just people that were there. They probably knew the law. We don't know how religious they were. It seems like they may have been, but I figured if they were, that the Bible would have told us that they were like that they were religious, they were law-abiding, they tried to do what was right. What I think happened is Mordecai was more interested in making sure that this girl that he had adopted from a very young age is safe, and that he doesn't want anything to go wrong. But she has this unique opportunity to become the queen. It's a long shot. Remember, we're looking at it from their perspective, not from a God perspective.
Yeah, who knew that would happen?
Right. And she's going to compete against every other woman in the area, right? Especially in her village where she lived. But she's also then going to compete against these other 400 women, right? That she was picked. So in round one, she was selected. They said, everybody bring forth your maidens and to present to the king. And Mordecai's like, I think I'm going to get you out here and do this. Okay? I don't know if he had to. He may have had to. The king made a decree. But anyway, so she gets out there and she's picked. Oh, that's round one. Now she's, instead of competing against the other thousands and thousands of women, remember last week we had the one where the king's officer who came out to all the villages was like, ooh, man, there's some women here. I don't want them to get anywhere near the king. But then he saw Esther. And, yep, we'll take that one. So they get to select. So they're weeding out the riffraff, so to speak. And she was not part of the riffraff. So she comes in, and Mordecai is afraid. Now, what is it that he's afraid of? I think he's afraid that if they find out that she's Jewish, they might go a little anti-Semitic on her and say, you can't participate because you're a Jew. So we're just not going to tell anybody. Now, the impression I get is nobody asked. You get that impression. You read this, nobody cared where she was from, but Mordecai cared. And I'm not really sure why he did. And like I said, there's no real big, biblical exposit about what was going on here. They didn't really say why did he care that she could have been ostracized if they found out that she was a Jew. Now, if you look at it today, there are times when people make comments and they want to hide their Jewish identity. So I think the guys, I believe Mark Levin was talking about it. I think Stephen Colbert is a Jew. He changed his name. That's not his name. He changed it because he was afraid that if I'm Jewish, I gotta be a Jewish comedian. Hey, there's lots of funny Jewish comedians.
Oh, he's not funny anymore.
He's not funny anymore.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a bunch of others out there that have Jewish names, and they've changed them because they don't want to be associated with it. Then there's other ones who kept their name, and they may not be religious Jews of today. But now, some of the people who wrote some things about this tried to relate this to Christianity, and I don't say that there's a relationship. They brought up Matthew 10, 32 and 33 that says, whoever confesses me before men, him will I also confess before my Father's in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I'll deny before the Father. Don't think it's relevant here. I think the guy was grasping for straws, he had nothing else to say, and sometimes Bible expositors want to talk. Don't think that this is the message that we should get from this, that we should go out and always just proclaim. For instance, I think I've mentioned this before. There's two strange groups of people out there. I'm sure there's more. But in my existence, I've come across two very strange groups of people. One of them are Christians. Sometimes they come across a little fruity. And if we're supposed to be out the light of the world, and we're weird, and people say, I don't know if I really want to be like that. Guy's weird. And the other one is train watchers. Christina laughs because they're called foamers, but you come up to a guy who's a train watcher, he loves trains, and like, all right, that he's a couple of sandwiches short of the picnic. So I like to think I'm a normal train watcher. I'm like, oh, look, a train. That's it. So you want to make sure that if you are out there proclaiming your Christianity, that you're doing it in a way that people would want what you have. Okay? That's what our whole job is. Our job isn't always to speak, to stand up there with a sign or hand out tracts and say, this is how I'm going to, witness to the world. And there's nothing wrong with that. Today we have the other option of we have podcasts. We can go online and we can give our message online. But there's some things you got to do. You got to show people that you have something that they're going to want. Okay? Because remember, and this goes along with all the garbage that's going on in the world today. We have faith to believe that we're going to heaven when we die. And at no greater point in my life did I see that faith shown throughout the world than Charlie Kirk's death. Because when you talk to other born-again Christians, they're like, well, no doubt Charlie Kirk was a Christian. He lived it. He had what people wanted. People loved it. And you know how you can tell that a lot of people loved it? Because there were the people who hated it because they were jealous of him.
Do you think he'll have a replacement?
His wife is taking over Turning Point.
No, she's taking over, but she's not going to be the speaker. You mean?
Well, they have thousands of speakers. They have people who
like
speak.
him? That.
Nobody. There's never going to be.
Well, that's what I'm wondering.
No. But we also need to be careful in that regard too, that we don't idolize a person over the Lord Jesus Christ. Yeah. We should be like Jesus. I look at, when I read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and see how Jesus responded, sometimes I wish, wow, I really wish I had that ability. There was a lot of times when they came down on him, and they would accuse him, and he spoke nothing. He didn't even defend himself. My first thought is, I'm going to jump out of my seat, and I'm going to defend myself up one side, down the other. But is that what Jesus would have done? The old WWJD, right? What would Joe do? I mean, what would Jesus do? I'd like to think that I would do what Jesus would do, but that's hard to do. It's hard to be like that.
Yeah, like when the woman came and he just wrote in the sand.
Yeah. or when they accused him of doing certain things and you're, stirring up trouble and
Yeah.
whatever, and he didn't respond.
Yeah.
He just sat there and he didn't respond. So, I think as Christians, we need to live our lives as Christians. And if we have deficiencies in our Christian life, we need to change them. But we shouldn't hide our Christianity when people are looking for a hope. Now, there was another one. Where was it? Okay, so Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. So someone put down there, however, we do recognize that there are situations where God may direct us to be more secretive about our Christian identity, not for the purpose of permanently concealing it, but waiting for the opportune moment to reveal it. Again, this is what Mordecai sensed was the right thing to do in these circumstances, and Esther agreed. Okay, so in some situations you might initially act as if you know nothing when approached by a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or anything like that, and do it not to deny Jesus, but to seize a strategic opportunity. Now that's what I do. There are times when there'll be a conversation going on, I want to become a part of it. I don't want them to know what side of that issue I'm on.
Yeah.
And if it's a religious debate of some sort, I'll sit back and I'll pose questions to people that would make them think, but not so much so that I would give away my hand until I'm ready to give it away. And in most of those debating situations, if you've ever watched a real debate, like Institute for Creation Research, I believe that's the one, used to be a debate organization where one person would get up, he would give his side, another person would get up and he would give his side. And now these debates go on throughout the country, but what you don't do in a debate is, if I'm debating Tony, I'm not debating, talking to him. I'm giving my side, trying to sell the audience, then Tony gets up, he gives his side, he tries to sell the audience, but there's no real interaction between the two. I find that in people who are not in it for the argumentative reason, those people, it usually doesn't get to the point where you have to divulge your side. You just make them think. And if they walk away confused, you've done your job. And then you leave the door open for them. Hey, we should talk about this again. Right? Didn't Pilate, wasn't he the one who said that? He goes, we should talk about this again. He goes, there's some truth to what you're speaking here. But he was confused as well. So it's not always bad to hide your identity and the things that you did, but trying to relate this to Christianity, where Mordecai did it. I think Mordecai did it because he was afraid. They find out she's a Jew, and it was between her and 5 other women, I
But
think.
did they find out at the end?
Much later. She was already the queen.
Okay.
They don't find out that she's Jewish for quite a while.
But it didn't matter.
It didn't matter at that point because she pleased him so well.
Mm.
And he decided that out of all of the women that were in that harem, she was the best. And so he took her, placed the crown on her head. And that was the end of that. But I don't think we get to that. We don't get to that until the end of chapter 2. All right, so then, the one thing that Mordecai did, and this goes back to faith. We talk a little bit about having faith. Every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's fate. And, hold on, because I want to read. Okay, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So he was kind of like, hey, what's going on in there today? Have you heard any news? As my kids would say, you have any tea to spill? They want to hear what's going on.
That's what they say now?
Yeah, that's what they think.
Oh.
And you got the tea? Used to be the 911, no, the 411.
Yeah.
What's the 411?
No, I never heard that.
So he would go in there, and he didn't have that either. There was no 411 back then either. So he would go back and he would pass by every day, probably on his way to the palace to do the king's business, whatever it was that he did for the king. And then we get into an interesting story about she was able to actually hear things as well as Mordecai. So it shows that in one sense, we know that they weren't really godly people, so there was he had the faith that he could hopefully take care of her, and that in where she was, it was good, but it was bad. If she wasn't chosen, she would have become what you would call an old maid. She could never go and be married to another man. She's one of the king's wives, but a wife that would probably never see the king ever again. Maybe, if she's lucky, one other time. Except for the queen. The queen then has the ability to spend a little bit more time with the king. So when you look at his faith, it wasn't like he had a God that he could trust in. I have to walk by and make sure she's doing okay, as opposed to God's going to take care of her in this place. All right? So we have to remember that. We have to always look through the lens of the people in the story and not what we, what we see. So, and I just wanted to read this one little thing. And it was called Moralism. And it was from some interesting things about the book, The Esther You Never Knew. And I like what he wrote, because a lot of times when we look at the story aspect of the Bible, we look at it through a moralistic lens. So moralism controls our reading of Scripture, especially the Old Testament. When we dust off the first 2/3 of the Bible and seek to find some spiritual wisdom, we often scurry around to find examples of morally upright people to show us how to live. We want to be like Abraham and like Jacob and follow in the footsteps of Joshua, Gideon, Daniel, and Moses. And when we get to the book of Esther, the same moralistic lens remains plastered to our faces, and we therefore see in this Jewish queen as an example of what we should do to be a good person. However, the Bible isn't primarily about what we should do, but about what God has done. God, not humanity, is the main character in the Old Testament, and he is always the hero. Sometimes he uses good people to do good things, but since there are hardly any good people, he ends up using messed up people to accomplish his will. And so he uses liars like Abraham, thieves like Jacob, and porn stars like Judah and Samson to accomplish his will. Because the Bible is not about God responding to our goodness, but about God using humanity to accomplish his will on earth, despite our moral bankruptcy. And the same is true of Esther. The book of Esther is not about a morally upright girl whom God uses because she's righteous. It's about God using someone who, like Judah in Genesis 38, is morally suspect. And then he goes into some reasons why, but we don't have to continue on with that until we get to some of the other aspects of it. But we take a look at the one thing that has always intrigued me about the Old Testament is how God chose someone not because they were worthy at all. Who was Abraham? Well, Abram at the time. He was a nobody. But God chose him. Why? Because he did something to deserve it? Nope. Now think about your own life as a Christian. Did God, and I don't want to say did God choose you, but did God come and knock on the door of your heart because you were worthy?
Mostly they were all nobodies.
They were all nobodies, and they were all pretty schemy people. With the exception of Daniel, I would say Daniel is probably one, and maybe Elijah.
David?
No, David had his faults.
Yeah, but not in the beginning.
No, that Sheba thing was right in the beginning.
Still.
He was a young man at the time, which is why he probably did that, because he was a young man and not an old guy who said, I don't have time for this nonsense.
I don't think so.
But when you look at all the nonsense that God had to tolerate from man, it's just man being man. And yet we try and apply some moral relevance to it because it's in the Bible that God chose this person because they had a morally high character or something like that. And in my studies, I only find one that happened with, whose character was above reproach and above anybody else's character in the Bible. It was in the book of Daniel. It's one of the reasons we spend so much time with it.
What about Samuel?
So there's not a whole lot written about like his whole life and how he lived it, but a lot of the prophets, they came on the scene and then they left. They did what God chose them. I need you to do this job for me. And he chose them, Jeremiah, right? Isaiah. But they had to go through some awful garbage, which that's how you know our ways aren't God's ways and God's ways aren't our ways. Because sometimes when you read what God wanted them to do and how he wanted them to do it, you don't understand. And maybe it's because it's not important for us to understand that. What's important is that they came on the scene, they did what God asked them to do, they either died at the end or they just disappeared again off the scene. And I look at the prophets a little bit different, and I think that God probably scoured the earth and said, I'm going to need somebody that will do what I ask them to do without giving me lip or without messing it up. Now, we take a look at two prophets that did not do what God asked them to do, but God used them anyway, right? One of them was Jonah. We see the story of Jonah. God said, I'm going to grab this guy. Now, God knows from beginning to end that he wasn't going to be a trustworthy person, but he used him anyway. And the other one was Samson, right? Samson never did what God wanted him to do. Hey, got 3 rules. And what are the 3 rules that he broke? All 3, right? Don't play with dead things, and he was twirling around a bone. He's eating honey from the inside of a dead bear, right? And
Drinking.
What's that?
Drinking.
Yeah.
He wasn't supposed to drink.
Yep. And then of course he started messing around with strange women. And then you take a look at some of the other heroes. Growing up, my hero was always Solomon. I looked at Solomon and was like, wow, but read about the end of Solomon's life, where he just grew weary and well-doing. He said, I've had enough. I can't handle this anymore. And God probably said to him, that's what you get for having 700 wives and 300 concubines. Told you it wasn't going to end well. And David was a little bit better, but even toward the end of David's life, when he was still doing things like don't number the people. I think I'm going to number people. Didn't I tell you not to number the people? Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Sorry. You know what I mean? So you see that God shows the humanity throughout the Old Testament, but we can't look at it always through a moralistic lens that God chose someone because they earned it, they deserved it, or in any way were worthy of the choosing. And in the Old Testament, it was clear that God chose them. Now, in the New Testament, we are given the ability to choose ourselves. Okay? I always go back to the verse. It says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. So if it says all things are lawful, it means that as a Christian, it doesn't matter what we do. All things are lawful. How come? Because everything is covered under the blood. Does that mean, is that a license to go out and sin any way we want? No, it's not. Because not all things are profitable. So when you don't have profit in something you're doing, it's because you broke the rule. And that's just cause and effect.
Why would it say that all things are lawful?
Because there's nothing that can take your salvation away. Once you're saved, it doesn't matter what you do. All the sins that you have committed from the time you were born into the time you die have been covered under the blood.
No.
So all things are lawful. God doesn't see your sin. Jesus put the covering of blood over the sin. That doesn't mean we're not going to suffer the consequences of that sin. It doesn't mean that we're not going to deal with the effects of it not being profitable, right? One of the things I think about is people who get divorced and then they get remarried. And, the Bible does not look upon that in a very good light. And then these people wind up having trouble. They have trouble because they have an ex-wife and they have a wife. Now, how is that any different than a king having 2 wives? Just you don't live with one. She's still your wife in God's eyes. And so the problems that brings into a relationship, but are all things are lawful? Of course they are. They're not going to stop you from going to heaven because you got divorced. But is it profitable? Not when you write out that check every month. It certainly wasn't profitable. It would have been better to fix what was broken than throw it away and buy a new one.
Or kill them and then,
Right, and that doesn't usually work out too well if you look through history, those that killed their spouse instead of divorcing them. And we have intimate knowledge with some, not me and Christina, but a close relative. And luckily nobody died. No one was hurt in the making of this comment. And so we have to remember that. We have to remember that God gave us free will to choose whether we want to love Him and whether we don't want to love Him. And that's really what it's all about. So I think in this situation, when we take a look at what Mordecai did by not revealing it, we don't blame him for what he did, because there was no real good reason for him to tell anybody. So he made a decision. Was it a bad decision? I don't think so. I think it was irrelevant at this point. Had he revealed it, what would have happened? We probably would have lost one chapter in Esther. But I don't think in the overall story, and God used it as a positive, because it added a little bit of intrigue and mystery to the story, because I think that one of Esther's things about what's he going to do when he finds out I'm a Jew? Is he going to get rid of me? Got rid of Vashti. So you wonder what was going through her mind. But then what did she say? She said, if he kills me, he kills me. I'll die doing what I need to do. I need to save my people. And of course we know the outcome of that he didn't kill her. So, and that's it. So we leave off with we left off at chapter, we got 10 and 11 done tonight. Any questions on that?
So when does the bad guy show up?
Soon.